Thank you very much, Sergio, and it's I who should be thanking you for the invitation to return to Sao Paulo and the Cardoso Fundação. It's a great pleasure. I remember 4 years ago our previous session, which was in this room, and very active discussion that evening. So I hope that this evening we also can have a very active discussion. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you all for coming this afternoon. And when I should begin by noting that 6 or 8 months ago, when Sergio contacted me about the possibility of returning to Sao Paulo to have this session, and we talked about having it around the time of the 19th Party Congress in China. The problem was 8 or 9 months ago.
I don't want to interrupt.
Oh, hello. Greetings. Nice to see you, sir. 8 or 9 months ago, when you contacted me, and I was living in Singapore at that time, actually, we didn't know when the Party Congress would take place exactly. We knew it would be somewhere in the September to November.
Actually, I
period.
knew it.
You had some.
I didn't tell you, but I knew it.
Well, you have some inside information with the Chinese that I don't have, because you chose the precise week and even the precise day of the Congress when we fixed this date. So in about I think 18 hours from now, in Beijing, of course, the new Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China will walk out on stage. And 7 men, we know that, they'll all be men, unfortunately, no women in the Chinese leadership. And they will walk out on stage in dark suits, we also know that. And they will all be wearing blue ties. Or they'll all be wearing red ties. I'm not sure which, but they'll match their colors. At any rate, in tomorrow afternoon in Beijing, we will see who the top 7 leaders of the country are going to be for the next 5 years, the so-called Standing Committee of the Political Bureau. And this evening, if you like, we can speculate a little bit on those personalities, but we won't know until tomorrow. But I can maybe offer some views on what certain personalities would mean for policy. So I'm going to, this evening, talk about the Congress, because it's been underway for about 5 days now. It opened last week. And I'm going to use the Congress as a kind of a way to talk about China's future. Which is a very, very large subject, but it's a subject on which I published my most recent book. And the Congress is discussing China's future to a certain extent. So I'm going to do both of those things. Talking about China's future is, of course, a very hazardous exercise, because any country's future, to try and predict, you can't predict a country's future with any great precision. It reminds me of the American former baseball player Yogi Berra, who you might have heard of. Yogi Berra once said that prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Yogi Berra had a lot of profound insights. That was one of them. So studying China reminds me of Yogi Berra. There are a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of even questionable assumptions. There are a lot of predictions that have not come true. There are damaged professional reputations amongst the China-watching community. And there are also some who get it right more often than not. But it's a hazardous thing to do. But it's an important thing to do if you're in the China field or if you're in any field. I think it's incumbent upon specialists to try and bring their expertise to bear on the subject that they supposedly specialize in, and to educate the public and media and other interested people and to bring their, their viewpoints out into public. So I try and do that in this book. And it reminds me of the fable of the three blind men in India who feel an elephant, but they all think they're feeling a different beast. You've probably heard that story too. China's a bit like that. It depends which part of the beast you feel as to the conclusions that you come to. And China is so complex that you can make a prediction or a statement about one aspect of China, and the opposite will also be true. China, huge country, very diverse place, many different contradictory trends going on simultaneously. This is a very difficult country to generalize about. So, in fact, that's one thing in the China field we are taught very early, don't generalize. But I still think that one should try and work with the available data, multiple sources of information, including sources from China. You have to go to China. You have to speak to Chinese. You have to live in China. So it's important that we bring these different perspectives to bear on China watching. But before I get into that, the future, that is, let's talk a little bit about the present and the party Congress that is going on. As I say, I cannot predict the outcome tomorrow, although maybe let's see if I'm right. Okay, so tomorrow afternoon, I expect Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang will be 2 of the 7 members. We are pretty certain of that. There will be 5 new faces in the Standing Committee of the Politburo. My guess is that Han Zheng will be one. He's the current party secretary of Shanghai. Li Jianshu will be another. He's currently the director of the so-called General Office of the Central Committee, Xi Jinping's right-hand man. Zhao Leji, I would guess, will be another one. He's currently in charge of the organization department of the Central Committee. And so those 4, are pretty certain. The last 3, less certain. But probably Wang Yang is I think has a very good chance of making the Standing Committee. It's just a question of what job Wang Yang gets. And then a former professor from Fudan University, Wang Huning. Wang Huning, I think, will be the other member. Is that 7 or is that 6? Am I still missing one? That's 6. Okay, so I think Wang Huning will make it. The big question mark is a man named Wang Qishan, who's 69 years old now. He's therefore over the age threshold for mandatory retirement. He's been the man in charge of the anti-corruption campaign for the past 5 years. He's also, if Li Jianshu is Xi Jinping's right-hand man, Wang Qishan is his left-hand man or something. They're very close. And there's a lot of speculation that Wang Qishan may be kept on either as the vice president of the country, which is a ceremonial position, or as the premier of the state council, which is anything but a ceremonial position. It's a very important substantive position. So in the last week or 2, there's been all kinds of speculation about this in the international community and media. And most people are expecting Wang Qishan will be one of those 7. The speculation recently is that he'll become the vice president. I don't buy that. I don't think that's going to be the case. He doesn't need to do that at his stage. He doesn't need an honorific post. If he's going to stay on in power, he should get a very serious post, and that should be the premiership. And nothing would be better for China than Wang Qishan becoming the premier. I'll go into the reasons for that during the talk tonight, but given the nature of the economic reform program in China, which has been rather stillborn, I would use that term, only partially implemented in the last 4 years, they really need a strong premier to implement the economic reform package that has been stalled. There's only one man in China who can do that. That's Wang Qishan. So if you're looking for indicators about China's economic trajectory, tomorrow there's no better indicator as to who is the premier. If it's not Wang Qishan, if it's Wang Yang or continues to be Li Keqiang, then my supposition is we're going to have 5 more years of stalled economic reform. It's not to say there's no economic reform going on. There is some. I'll talk about that this evening. But the premiership is frankly the only personnel decision of this Congress of any great importance, I would say. All these other men are rather interchangeable parts. They're kind of like musical chairs. It doesn't really matter, who is the chairman of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, who's the vice president, who's the head of the CPPCC. Why? Because Xi Jinping is in charge. He's in charge of everything and everyone. China has, I'll talk about this tonight too, but he is so dominant as a leader that unlike the last 40 years, really, where it did matter which 7 men walked out on stage because the other 6 had a role to play, a substantive role to play. Not so now. Xi Jinping is so dominant that the other 6 individuals' positions are really minimized and emasculated. The only one, as I say, that really does matter is the premiership. Okay, so what have we seen in the Congress so far? They've been going now for 5 days. Well, one startling thing we've seen is the accusation in one of these side meetings. So, they meet the first day in plenary session. Xi Jinping gives a big, long report, 2.5 hours long, and then they break up into smaller working groups, you might say, based on provinces and profession. So if you come from the military, you meet with the military for 2 or 3 days. Well, there was a group of economists, I think, that met, and a senior economist accused Sun Jung-sai and 3 other individuals of trying to organize a coup d'etat against Xi Jinping. I don't know if you've heard this news in the last week. That's the most startling news to come out of the Congress so far. And I really have to question whether this was reported accurately, and certainly question whether this man Sun and these others were guilty of a collective coup d'etat. Okay, so there have been four individuals amongst more than 1 million who have been taken down and put in prison in the last 5 years. Sun Jung-sai was the head of the party committee in Chongqing and was earmarked or identified as being a possible successor to Xi Jinping. He's one of the top 2 likely successors to Xi Jinping. Well, about 6 weeks ago, boom, removed from his position. About 2 weeks ago, boom, removed from the party, stripped him of his party membership. And now he's imprisoned and awaiting charges of very serious, what do they call it, very serious discipline problems. And now we have this other man who's come out in the Congress and said that Sun Jung-sai, together with 3 other individuals, who have tried to mount a coup d'etat. So that's rather startling news, but I'm not sure how much credence to give it. I'm not sure we should. So far we've had Xi Jinping's speech. That's really the most important thing. So let me just begin with giving you my own quick sort of synopsis of the speech, having waded through it. It was a 2.5 hour long speech. Took me about three times that time to read it and digest it, I have to say. Really mind-numbing speech. But, it's filled with lots of slogans and repetitive terms. They use the term socialism with Chinese characteristics 146 times. They use the term people 202 times. They only use the term Marxism 19 times. He used the term great power 26 times. He had lots of other slogans, the 4 greats, the 4 comprehensives, the 3 stricts, the 3 earnests, the 4 awarenesses, the 4 self-confidences, the 5-in-1 overall layout. This is Chinese communist vocabulary, right? This is the way they speak to each other. It's not exactly intellectually uplifting. And you have to decode. I mean, if you're trying to study China, you have to decode all these slogans. What's really underneath them? And maybe there's some real substance there. So the speech, I found it to be more forward-looking than previous speeches at other party congresses. Usually these speeches look backwards over the past 5 years and kind of recap the accomplishments of the last 5 years. Xi Jinping did that, and he took credit for a lot of accomplishments. But there was an overall tone that looked into the future, I think, with his speech in a number of ways. So he outlined those in 14 categories. And I think for the sake of time this evening, I'm not going to list all 14 for you. Otherwise, it would take too much time. But it was fairly comprehensive. They want to build the country into a what he did announce was a 2-stage movement towards socialist modernization. So by 2035, the first phase, the so-called foundation for a well-off society, will be accomplished. Xiaokang Shehui, they call it. And then by 2050, full socialist modernization will be accomplished, middle of the century. A few other takeaways. He spent a lot of time talking about social issues, various social issues, more than I remember previous Communist Party leaders doing. He talked a lot about poverty alleviation. He wants to eliminate all poverty in China by the year 2020. That's 3 years from now. And they still have 100 million people who live under the World Bank absolute poverty line. That will be an accomplishment. We wish him well with that. But he talked about that. He also talked at some length about social inequality, which China has quite a lot of. The Gini coefficient in China is now 4.47. That's the Chinese government's estimate. The World Bank thinks it could be up around 5. Other estimates put it a little bit lower, 4.3, 4.4. But China's got one of the top 5, I believe, Gini coefficients in the world today, which is a measure of course, of income inequality. So Xi Jinping stressed that issue. He talked about social security. He spent a lot of time talking about social values and morals, and the environment and housing. He said, at one point, I like this, he said, houses are to be lived in, not speculated on, right? Which is a reference to the housing bubble in China. So a lot of time talking about social issues. By contrast, relatively little time on economic issues. There was only one section, 2.5 pages long, and it was at a pretty general level. There was not much specificity at all. And there was no, that I could find, reiteration of the third plenum reform package, by which I reference in 2013, the third plenary session of the last Central Committee had a major meeting and rolled out this very ambitious economic reform plan. 64 categories, only over 350 individual economic reforms. That was 4 years ago. By far the most ambitious plan the Chinese have rolled out since the third plenum of 1978. It's a great plan, great blueprint. The World Bank basically wrote it for them. If you read the China 2030 report and then you read the third plenum plan, almost identical. And it's exactly the blueprint for China's future economically, what they need to do. But if you read Xi Jinping's speech this week, he didn't mention third plenum once. And he didn't mention the content of the third plenum plans at all. So that's a little surprising to me. As I indicated a minute ago, we've seen very slow movement towards implementing that package in the last 4 years. So if, what are we to take away from the fact that he didn't even reference these reforms in his recent speech? He did talk a lot about, or not a lot, twice. He mentioned supply-side structural reform. He did have a lot of discussion about innovation. He mentioned the market several times, but in rather vague ways. For example, he said we need to strengthen market-based allocation factors and improve the market supervision system. I'm not exactly sure what he means by either of those. But he did talk about China becoming a world-class manufacturing power by 2035, deepening the reform of state-owned enterprises. This is interesting because obviously state-owned enterprises are one of the major impediments to China's economic future, most economists believe. Not Xi Jinping. He thinks it's one of the greatest attributes of China, the state-owned enterprises. He wants to make them bigger, stronger, national champions that go out in the world and dominate international commerce as well as domestic. And he called for the SOEs to, quote, possess global competitiveness. So, you know, if you're sitting in a country like Brazil or anywhere, United States, you can expect more big national champion SOEs from China to arrive on the scene wishing to buy your property and invest in your country. So he talked about that. He did mention the need to enhance intellectual property rights. That was encouraging. He at one point mentioned the need to break up monopolies. Well, if he wants to break up monopolies, why don't you start with the SOEs? But, you know, these speeches take over a year to prepare. They go through dozens of drafts, and there's input into the speeches from many different organizations and people in China, in the Communist Party. This one has been in preparation for 14 months, we're told. So the resulting product, the 30,000 character product, is a kind of composite of inputs from various organizations. So one organization may say, break up monopolies. Another organization may say, strengthen state-owned enterprises, right? There's an obvious contradiction between these two things. But these speeches are kind of an amalgamation of different policy interests. He also did offer rather vague assurances for improving the operating environment for foreign firms in China. This is encouraging. That's what foreign firms want to hear, because foreign firms are finding it very difficult to operate in China in the last few years, increasingly difficult. Instead of opening to the outside world, which they claim they're doing on a daily basis, in terms of foreign firms operating in China, they're closing. You read the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, or the American Chamber of Commerce, or I don't know about the Brazilian Chamber of Commerce, but there is a unified view that the operating environment has not only become more expensive, it's more costly for foreign firms to operate in China for various reasons, but it's become more bureaucratically difficult. And there just aren't, they're not allowed to distribute. There's all kinds of barriers placed in front of foreign firms in China. And then, of course, the Chinese want to go out into the world and invest all over the planet with no barriers to themselves, and they don't seem to see a contradiction between those two things. So, but, you know, Xi Jinping did mention that he wanted to improve this. Okay, that's good. So the economic part of the speech, rather vague. It's more important what was not in there than what was in there, I would say, when I read it. Again, you can go through the 350 third plenum reforms, and I'll challenge you to find 5 that were in the third plenum package that were in Xi Jinping's speech. So he's clearly walking away from the third plenum package, which he himself personally rolled out 4 years ago. I don't quite understand that. I don't know why that is. I would just observe it. A couple other observations about his speech. Nothing on political reform. The term 政治改革 wasn't mentioned once. Why? Because he doesn't want any 政治改革in China. Instead, there were repeated references to the party's political construction and building the ideology of socialism with Chinese characteristics. He did mentioned a couple of times the term inter-party democracy, which is encouraging because there isn't a whole lot of it going on inside the party in the last few years under him. But basically, everything in the speech was about strengthening party control over everything. As he said in one point, saying to Sergio, I've never heard a Chinese leader put it this way, 4 words, the party leads all, quote unquote, the party leads all. So that's his image, vision for China. Strong party, strong China. And, you know, you can probably assume that his vision is without a strong party, there will not be a strong China. And of course, the whole narrative that he's been speaking about for the last few years of China's great rejuvenation, the China achievement of the China dream, this is all about China reclaiming its place as a major global power. But he is of the view that you can't do that without a very strong party leading the way. Okay. Last 2 observations I have. Military received 2 pages in the report, a little bit over 2 pages. The military received as much space in the report as the economy did. Now think about that. That tells you something about his priorities too. And to his credit, military reform has been one of the very top priorities under Xi Jinping in the last 5 years. They have undertaken a series of reorganizations of the structure of the People's Liberation Army and at the top of the system, the military regions. They're certainly continuing to build new equipment, very capable new equipment in all spheres, from cyber to missiles to ships to planes, submarines, you name it. And so the military has received a lot of emphasis from him, and he has said, as he did again in this speech, the military needs to prepare to fight and win wars. So that's his view. The military, however, has been riddled with corruption, like other elements in China. The military, there have been, in the last 5 years, there have been over 4,000 officers, around 110 generals, and 4 members of the Central Military Commission, that's the highest level body in China, who have been purged for corruption. I repeat those numbers, 4,000 officers, 110 generals, 4 Central Military Commission members. The PLA has never had a gutting or, you know, sort of cleansing. He would call it a cleansing, I'm sure. Xi Jinping would call this a cleansing. And maybe it needed cleansing. It sounds apparently that it did. But my point is that the organizational changes of the PLA, which for the first time since 1949, for the first time in over 60 years, 67 years in power, they have changed the way that the military is organized from a Soviet model to a quasi-American model with combined arms, joint operations, theater commands. So they've, you know, trying to change, it's like a steamship, a great vessel, great ship that you try and turn, and it's not easy to turn it. 67 years of Soviet-style organization, not easy to change. It's going to take, I have several friends in the Chinese military, one of whom told me this summer, David, it's going to take at least 10 years for us to implement these reforms. You don't just announce them and assume they're being implemented. These are very difficult bureaucratic reforms with a lot of very deeply vested interests in the General Staff Department, General Logistics Department, General Political Department, and the services. So that organizational reform has really jarred the PLA. And you combine that with the anti-corruption purges of personnel, this is an organization that has really taken a 1-2 punch from Xi Jinping. And it's going to be interesting to see how they respond. Last point I'd make about his report is in foreign policy section. It was relatively brief, came at the end. Normally, these reports at Congresses do not talk a lot about foreign policy anyway, but he did. He didn't mention any single country or any single issue. He didn't talk about U.S.-China relations. He didn't talk about North Korea. He didn't talk about China-Brazil relations or anything else specifically. He kept it at a very high level, and he spoke of building community of common destiny. This is another one of his signature narratives. Another signature program of Xi Jinping's, One Belt, One Road. That got a lot of reference. And he spoke a lot about global governance and China's contributions to global governance, which is, I would suggest, is one of the major accomplishments of Chinese foreign policy under Xi Jinping. And for amongst other reasons, because of Xi Jinping. He has personally invested himself in China contributing to global public goods and the concept of global governance in a way that none of his predecessors have ever done before. You may, be familiar with the view that China has been criticized by the Americans and others for free riding on the international system, not contributing proportionately to its capabilities as a major power, financial power, if nothing else. And people like Robert Zoellick called on China to become a responsible international stakeholder. So there have been lots of criticism of China for not carrying enough of responsibility. Well, not under Xi Jinping. He has really upped China's game in this sphere, to China's credit and to the world's benefit. This is really good news. All kinds of areas from, climate change. There would have been no Paris, COP21 climate change accord if it were not for China. Just think about the position China took in Copenhagen in 2009, and then finally where they came out in Paris. Anti-piracy operations, pandemics, global disaster relief, international peacekeeping operations, global economic governance in the G20. China's by far been the most active member of the G20. The BRICS, there would be no, that was a Chinese initiative originally, too. So I give Xi Jinping and the Chinese a lot of credit for their role in global governance over the last 5 years. Okay, so that's more or less my takeaway from the speech last Friday. As I say, in about 18 hours, we'll be able to judge more about the country's future trajectory based on the men who are going to lead it. But frankly, as I say, other than the premiership, I don't think these other 6 men are very important. It's all about Xi Jinping. So we don't have to play the name game, we call it, this time as we have in previous Congresses. This has become a very dominant, sorry. Okay, well, there's a slide that I didn't come through. But the point I want to make before I transition into China's future is that this has become a patriarchal, patrimonial type political system under Xi Jinping. No longer a collective or consensus-based political system, which is what Deng Xiaoping 4 decades ago set about trying to institutionalize after the Maoist era. Deng Xiaoping said, look, we've had 30 years of one strong man rule, and it brought disaster to the country. So Deng Xiaoping very consciously tried to institutionalize the government, separate the party from the government, rebuild party institutions that had been decimated by the Cultural Revolution, and build the quality of cadres, train them better. But he really believed, Deng Xiaoping did, that China's leadership should be a consensual and a collective one. And for 4 decades, for 40 years, that's what China's been doing. Jiang Zemin tried to do that. Hu Jintao tried to do that. Xi Jinping is not doing that, just the opposite. He has rolled back the collective consensual reforms that Deng started. And we are back now to more or less the position that Deng Xiaoping found China in 1978 when it comes to politics. Strong man rule, vested in one individual. Xi Jinping has all this power. He chairs all the leading groups. Everything is about him. And his theory now, his Sixiang they call it, is going to be put into the party constitution tomorrow. Only one other leader in China's 67-year history, the People's Republic of China, has their Sixiang put into the party constitution. That's Chairman Mao. So Xi Jinping is now putting himself on the same plane with Chairman Mao in terms of ideology. So, you know, I would call this system a patriarchal system, patrimonial system, but a patrimonial system where there is no grease in the wheels. The anti-corruption campaign, as necessary as it has been, has also undermined a lot of the perks in the system that people have grown accustomed to. I would argue China politically has regressed under Xi Jinping. It has not progressed, it's regressed. Economically, it's progressed, but as I'll describe here, it hasn't progressed as much as they themselves say it should, and others have expected them to. Okay, so let's, that's the party Congress. What about China's future? Well, I think when we're thinking about China's future, we've got to not just see China qua China. China, I like to say, is distinct, but it is not unique. What do I mean by that? Well, it has, we need to look at China through comparative lenses, 3 comparative lenses in particular that you'll see there on the screen. Because that will help us understand the challenges that the country and the regime are facing, and based on the experiences of other countries, where China may go. So the first of these 3 comparative lenses you'll see is that of a newly industrializing economy. China is a NIC. It is a middle-income NIC. Let me give you 3 numbers in reference to this: 101, 13, and 11. What do you think these 3 numbers have in common? Anybody want to venture a guess? They're prime numbers, yes. You're a mathematician. I'll save you the guessing. So the World Bank has tells us in a number of studies, but including a major study they did about 6 or 7 years ago, that since 1960 there have been 101 countries that have entered middle income status, right? World Bank divides economic development into lesser developed or developing country, middle income, and developed. So, and in the middle income, intermediate level is subdivided into lower and upper middle income. So when you reach $9,000 per capita income per year, you become a middle income, newly industrializing economy. Of the 101 countries since 1960 that have reached that stage, only 13 have emerged out of the middle income stage to become a fully developed economy. It's 13 out of 101. You can do the math in your mind. That's about 90% failure rate, if you want to put it that way, which is why they use the term middle income trap. You get trapped there. You never emerge out. 88 out of 101 never made it through the trap. Of the 13 that did, 11 were autocracies, political autocracies, authoritarian political systems. When they went into the trap, all 13 were one form or another of a democracy by the time they emerged out of the trap. Greece, Israel were democracies before they entered the trap. The other 11 transitioned politically during that time. So, according to the World Bank, the experience of 101 countries, most countries get stuck in the trap, and those that don't all liberalize politically to some degree or another. So there's a clear correlation there. The other clear evidence from the 101 countries is that innovation is critical. If you don't add value, if you don't move away from an import substitution, low surplus labor, low wage model producing basically low-end manufactured products for export, if you don't transition from that model, and that's the model that takes countries generally from the developing to the middle income status, right? The question is, once you're middle income, you need value added. How do you get value added? Answer, innovation. And there's lots of types of innovation. It's a very complicated subject. It's not just about technological innovation. You can have innovation in management, communications, all kinds of types of innovation. But if you don't innovate, you don't add value to your economy, you don't escape the trap. So this is no great secret, and the Chinese, no secret to the World Bank. And as I say, the World Bank wrote the Chinese Third Plenum Report for them, basically. And that's why Xi Jinping spends a lot of time in his report last week talking about innovation. It's crucial, absolutely crucial. So that's the first comparative perspective we need to remind ourselves of. The linkage between politics and economics, and the linkage between innovation and economic development. Okay, let's go back. Second comparative lens, excuse me, that we need to view China through is as a Leninist political system. Leninist political systems are a subtype of authoritarian political systems. There are a wide variety of authoritarian political systems in history and at present. In fact, authoritarianism is making a real comeback under the term populism in the last few years. But Leninist systems are a particular type. They have several characteristics, including this, what we call the cellular penetration of all institutions in society. That is to say, they embed party committees inside of all institutions and control them thereby, like embedding an organism inside the body of higher education or banking or whatever sector. You choose the sector, the party is there. That's why Xi Jinping says the party controls all. He means all. Even foreign-owned enterprises now in China have to have party committees in them. So penetration and control. And one way you control is not just the party committee, you appoint the leaders of 1,300 institutions in China. If you're the president of Peking University, you are appointed by the organization department of the Communist Party. If you're the head of one of the four big banks, you're appointed by the organization of the Chinese Communist Party. If you're a mayor or a governor, you're appointed by the organization department of the Chinese Communist Party. This is Leninism. Other authoritarian systems don't do things this way. So they control a country through personnel and through penetration by the party of all bodies. That's what we call hegemonic party control. And they brook no challenge to their hegemonic party control at all. Some of them, sometimes China's been a little bit more tolerant of dissent and open media, but not in the last 8 years. So they control all propaganda, all information, all personnel, the military, the internal security services, and social groups, NGOs, and civil society. This is what you call a hegemonic political system. So all these Leninist systems get to a point, they pass through what I call a Leninist life cycle of 7 stages, and they get to the 6th stage, and the bureaucracy gets a little sclerotic, frozen up, overly bureaucratized, corrupt, and the citizenry becomes increasingly frustrated with their opportunities and access to information in society. So there's always this point in Leninist systems where there's the challenge for the regime to either open up and try and manage that opening process, to do it from above, or not, to crack down. So what have we seen in China? Since 1978 in Deng Xiaoping, we've seen the regime go back and forth between this attempted managed opening and then a reversion. They get scared and they crack down, and then they go back to opening. In the China field, we call this the Fang Shou cycle, the Fang Shou Zhouqi. Fang for opening, Shou for closing. And basically, there have been about 6 phases. We have roughly 6 or 7 years of opening, and then followed by 2-3 years of crackdown. Followed by, they go back to 6 or 7 more years of relative opening, followed by 2 years of crackdown. So it's gone back and forth this way for 40 years. But the current phase of closing, crackdown, began in 2009. We are now into year number 8. So we're like 5 years overdue for a return to what I call soft authoritarianism. So these two cycles, it's a choice I argue in the book between hard authoritarianism and soft authoritarianism. So Xi Jinping is of the view that hard authoritarianism is the best way to proceed. But the point I want to make is that China is not unique. You know, the Soviet Union went through this. If Khrushchev had not been overthrown in 1964 by Brezhnev, the opening period would have continued. But after 27 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. But by the time Gorbachev came along, the system was so sclerotic that it couldn't take the reforms Gorbachev introduced. And it kind of collapsed under its own weight. So that's a comparative view. Finally, Chinese history. If you know, they've been around for 5,000 years, and it's important to study the dynastic cycle, we call it. Because these dynasties aren't all exactly the same, but there's a lot of commonalities in them, and particularly in the downward phase of the dynasty. Increased factional scheming at the imperial court, attempts on the life of the emperor occasionally, you know, coups d'etats, popular unrest, emperors who become isolated and tyrannical, a state ideology that the regime insists on but is hollow in content and people don't believe, but they have to profess that they believe it. There's a kind of falsity in the Qing and Ming that one also sees today. Economic dislocations, natural disasters, and pressure on China's borders. So if you look at the Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, they all had those features in the final declining phase. Several of those features are present today. So looking at China's future, I'm sorry I've taken too long on the history here, but it's important to, once again, realize that China's not unique. China's it's now a middle-income, newly industrialized economy. It's a Leninist political system, and it has its own historical patterns. And we have to bear all those in mind. So let me now here's my Leninist life cycle, sorry. I must have sent you the wrong PPT slides. These are a little bit out of order, but it's okay. So you see there at the bottom the Feng Shou cycle I've discussed. And there's the 6 phases of Leninist regimes you can read for yourself. Okay, so let's change course here for the remainder of the time, maybe the next 10 minutes?
Right.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Excuse me. And I'm going to just highlight, in terms of China's future, what I see to be some of the major challenges that they're facing. I'm going to let you digest these and read these for yourself, because each of them are very complicated. We would be here all evening if we actually go through these in any detail. So beginning with the economy, there are at least those dozen challenges, some of which Xi Jinping spoke about in his speech. He talked about industrial overcapacity, for example. He didn't say anything about debt. That's the biggest challenge facing China's economy today. Almost 282% of GDP now. That's red light flashing territory for economists. Industrial restructuring. There's no labor market to speak of because they haven't reformed the hukou system. Stock market bubbles, housing market bubbles, no financial sector restructuring. Actually, in the last 6 months, they have begun to do that a bit. Capital outflight, $1 trillion a year left the country in the last 3 years. They're hemorrhaging money, and now they're trying to institute very rigorous controls on this money. And the failure to implement the third plenum reforms. So there's a long list that foreign economists, when they look at the Chinese economy, they see a lot of challenges. I'm not going to say these are insurmountable challenges, but they're serious. There's also some good news, a fair amount of good news in the Chinese economy. Growth still between 6 and 7%. The economy is a $10.5 trillion economy. Second largest in the world and still on track to overtake the United States by 2025. Private sector is driving economic growth. 70% of growth in GDP in the last 2 years has been driven by private business. Li Keqiang, the premier, one thing he can take credit for and deserves credit for is regulatory streamlining. They've cut a lot of red tape, something like 1,400 regulations that for the state council and at the provincial level. So that's good. They're very fixated on innovation. They know that that is the key to the value-added economy and to the future. They're investing a lot of money into the R&D sector, 2.3% of GDP, which is actually below OECD levels, substantially below. You know, South Korea is the world's highest contributor to R&D at 3.7%, followed by Taiwan at 3.6%, Germany 3.5%, United States, or Japan, sorry, 3.4%, United States 3.3%. All the OECD countries are above 3% of GDP. China's down there at 2.3%, and that's up actually from 1.7% just 2 years ago. So, but 2.3% of $10 trillion is still a lot of money. And they know they want to, they're putting it into 11 or 12 areas they want to become world leaders in. So they know where they want to go, and they're investing in it. This is industrial policy. They're treating innovation, I would observe, the same way they treat everything else, from high-speed rail to anything. It's like fixed asset investment. You invest in, you water the plant will grow. It's their theory of innovation. Well, it will grow. They are going to become world leaders if they're not already in things like high-speed rail. But artificial intelligence, the health sciences, broadly speaking, nanotech, biotech, green energy, a variety of sources. They've just announced they want to eliminate fossil fuel cars by 2030. Nothing but electric cars in China as of 2030. That would be great. And other priority areas. So they are investing. They get it. They get the innovation thing. And One Belt, One Road is a dramatic initiative. It's early days, but my goodness, this thing, a $10 to $12 trillion or $10 to $14 trillion project involving 68 countries across Asia, Eurasia, I should say, Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean, Middle East, and up through Europe. As far as I know, Latin America is not part of One Belt, One Road yet, but they'll figure out some way to get it involved, I'm sure. But this is very, very impressive, and I have to say it's very needed. I've just spent 6 months living in Southeast and traveling throughout Southeast Asia. Those countries in particular need the kind of infrastructure China can offer. So, you know, there is some good news going on. RCEP is the Chinese version of TPP. So the economy has good news and bad news. Social trends, a lot. Here, the glass of water is less than half full. There's very high levels of income inequality. Xi Jinping, you know, was correct to point that out as one of the major challenges in the next 5 years. The second bullet point, middle and upper classes moving their personal assets abroad. $1 trillion a year, as I say. And this is not corporate investment. This is your and my money. People are voting with their wallets and their feet. They're moving themselves, they're moving their family members, they're moving their own personal money overseas. Well, and that's an economic issue when it reaches the level of $1 trillion a year. But I would argue it's a political issue, because anytime the elite of a country begin to move their family members and their own money out, that tells you something about their lack of confidence in their own country's future. That's the way I read it. And they've all got one foot out the door. Some of them, well, they can't have 2 passports because China doesn't allow dual nationality. They would have 10 passports if they could. But there's a pent-up element of the elite here wishing to move abroad. Mass unrest, we read reports of nearly 200,000 incidences of mass unrest. That's a term used by the Ministry of State Security, or Public Security itself. What I call the volatile periphery, Xinjiang and Tibet, which are under virtual martial law lockdown. Then you have Hong Kong and Taiwan. So you have these 4 major elements of China around the periphery that are very volatile. That's why I call it the volatile periphery. Severe repression of civil society in the last 8 years. I've already mentioned that. Demographic and urbanization transition, environment, and so on. So lots of social challenges, that none of which were talked about in Xi Jinping's speech, except the income inequality issue. Current political climate, the third slide. I've already talked about this, but the point I guess I'd like to emphasize is that the anti-corruption campaign and the personalization of power that Xi Jinping himself has undertaken in the last 5 years has not only broken the collective consensual decision-making norm that Deng Xiaoping started, it has produced a culture of fear throughout the party and the state and the military bureaucracy. Everybody is worried that they are going to get caught up in this campaign. Now, to be sure, it is an anti-corruption campaign, and to be sure, there are a lot of corrupt people in China that are being caught up in the campaign, but it's also become a kind of a purge of individuals who are opposed in one way or another to Xi Jinping's rule, whether they're in the Youth League or other elements. So the system has actually, the Chinese use the term "tingzhi" when you talk to them about this. It means to freeze up. The bureaucratic system is not functioning, and that's one reason that the economic reform policies of the Third Plenum are not being implemented. Cadres are afraid to do their job. They're afraid to even go to the office in some cases. And then we have, finally, across-the-board repression of civil society, media, intellectuals, higher education, social media. This is the worst it's been in China since the aftermath of 1989 in Tiananmen. It's not as bad now as it was then, I know. I lived there then from 89 to 92. That was bad. That was martial law. That was real totalitarianism. It's not that bad, but it's trending in that direction, and it's quite close. And Xi Jinping, there's not a liberal bone in his body. And so we can expect, I think, in the next 5 years, not a loosening, but an accelerated tightening of the civil society sphere, unfortunately. And then, so that's politics, Congress. Foreign relations, I think we have to say, are going pretty well. And this is an interesting contradiction because internally, I see the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping himself acting in a profoundly insecure manner. This is a man and a party who are afraid of something, afraid of being overthrown. They're afraid of the Soviet experience, and they wake up every morning and go to bed every night thinking about the Soviet Union. And I'm not kidding. Xi Jinping gives speeches about the Soviet collapse with some regularity. The propaganda apparatus in China with regularity has campaigns and articles and films that are mandatory viewing. You should view one called The Silent Contest, 3.5 hours long, about why the Soviet Union collapsed, and if we don't do certain things here in China, we will also have that. So they are obsessed, the party, with the Soviet Union. I don't think they need to be honest with you. I don't understand, with a $10 trillion economy and all the things that are going right in China, there's a whole lot of things going right in China. Then why are they acting in such a reactive, repressive, regressive, insecure manner domestically? I don't get it, to be honest with you. But if you turn to the outside world, China's external posture, it's exactly the opposite. They're acting with enormous confidence and presence around the world. They're doing really well. They have become, this present tense, one of, if not, the world's leading powers. And Trump is, of course, helping that on a daily basis. The Americans are abdicating that space. And China, it's an interesting open question to see whether China is going to be able to fill that space and the vacuum that Trump is creating. I have my doubts. I think the Chinese aren't ready yet. If you remember, Sergio, 4 years ago when I was here, I talked about my previous book called China Goes Global, The Partial Power. Well, I still see China as a partial power in several areas, but to be sure, they've surprised me too. They've done really well in the last 4 years, and Xi Jinping deserves a lot of credit for it. He himself, his vision for China, his role in global governance, the military modernization, relations with their neighbors in Asia, all improved. In fact, there are only 2 countries in the world with whom China does not have really positive relations. You know what they are? North and South Korea. Seriously. They have very strained relations with North Korea for reasons that we're all familiar with. You may not be as familiar with how bad their relations with South Korea have become because of the American missile defense system that has been put in place in South Korea. The Chinese are punishing South Korea economically, cutting off investment, cutting off trade, cutting off students, I've heard recently from the South Korean embassy in Washington, cutting down flights, tourism, banning group tourism. They are just punishing South Korea economically to try and pressure them to get rid of the American THAAD system. Otherwise, though, you go across the world, China's got good or mixed relations, but essentially positive relations with every other country, including the United States. Yes, we have problems in the U.S.-China relations, no shortage of problems, but it's a functional relationship. The American president's about to go to Beijing in 2 weeks' time. It works. We have, high-level dialogues. We have lots of interdependence. So the U.S.-China relationship is not falling apart, and I would argue that none of China's international relationships are falling apart. They're in pretty good shape. So I just note there's a contradiction there between what's going on internally and what's going on externally, and I honestly don't have an answer for why. Okay, let me just really conclude, Sergio, with 2 last slides on the possibilities for China's future. So I thought that the use of a kind of roundabout metaphor might be helpful here, because there's no single pathway for any country's future. There's alternative pathways. And so there are, 4 pathways here that I identify. But it's important to know for a car driving into a roundabout, the path you're already on, because there's what political scientists call a high propensity towards path dependency. In other words, you stay on the path you're already on. It's easiest. You don't violate other vested interests. It's a lot easier to keep doing what you're doing. So what path are they on? Hard authoritarianism. They could stay on that path. They could take the second left-hand turning out of the roundabout and just carry on as they are. And every indication from Xi Jinping's speech last week is that's what we're going to get. The next 5 years are what we've had the last 5 years, but perhaps even more. Or it could conceivably become even more repressive domestically, which is what I label neo-totalitarianism. It's not, as I said, 89 to 92, but it's trending in that direction. If they went back and instituted those kinds of controls again, which they have in Tibet and Xinjiang, that is a conceptual possibility, but I'm not sure they're going to go there, and I think they'd get a lot of resistance if they did. So then the other 2 choices is to go back to soft authoritarianism, which is what they were doing from 1997 to 2008, a decade long under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Just before the end of Hu Jintao's term, they shifted back to hard authoritarianism, and they've been on that path ever since. So they could go back. They could go back to the opening. This Fang Shou cycle could repeat itself, but I don't see any indications of that, unfortunately. Semi-democracy, actually, if I had to redo this slide, it would grow out of soft authoritarianism. Of those 13 or 12 countries I noted at the beginning, they all went through soft authoritarian phases before they democratized. So it's not like going into a restaurant and ordering democracy off the menu as opposed to soft authoritarianism. The starter is soft authoritarianism and the entree is democracy, right? You have to go through that phase. So what happens with these 4 alternative possibilities? Well, if they go towards neo-totalitarianism, which I do not anticipate, then they're going to regress politically even more quickly. They will atrophy. The party will continue to atrophy, and maybe the economy would continue to atrophy. And at some point in time, the regime could have a Soviet moment. That's if they crack down even more, they're accelerating their demise. If they stay on the path they're on now, hard authoritarianism, they're going to get what they've been getting, some limited economic reform, but not broad-based, as the third plenum would argue. They're going to get some economic stagnation, by which I mean they are not transitioning to the third plenum package, to the World Bank recommendations. They're fixated on credit, fixed asset investment, and debt. pouring more concrete and building more buildings, more roads, more hard infrastructure. That's not going to get them out of the middle income trap and up the value added chain. That's what I mean by stagnation. And they'll have political decline, which I see them as in a declining phase politically. Or they can go to soft authoritarianism. They're going to have a lot better chances of accomplishing their third plenum economic reforms, and they'll have a lot better chances of political transition. Maybe someday to democracy with Chinese characteristics. So why don't I stop there? That's their choice. They can basically choose between hard and soft authoritarianism. The ultimate question I pose at the bottom there is, does the CCP have the confidence to open up politically in order to succeed economically and socially? Politics is now the independent variable, and economics is the dependent variable. It's the opposite of the last 40 years. So Xi Jinping shows no evidence at all of wanting to open up politically. He thinks he can have his cake and eat it too. He can have a really strict Leninist political regime, and he can have a modern economy. That's the big gamble. That's the big bet. That's the big question. We're all going to have to wait and see who's right. So I will stop there.